Shalom Mishpacha. I've missed you all so much. I am really excited to share a word with you, 2 words with you this week. We will have 2 Hebrew words of the week because there's a very important relationship between these words, and I want to illustrate how, and I think we've seen this over and over again, but I want to illustrate how the meanings behind the letters that inform us to the words don't just extend to the definitions of words, but also to names, and how no matter what that name is, no matter how important or insignificant that name may seem in the Tanakh, that it being a Hebrew name is going to inform us about the meaning, the deeper dimensions of that name by the very letters it's composed of. So let's go ahead and start. We're going to start with Avram. The name Avram, we might say in English Abram, but in fact, as you notice, the Beit is missing a dagesh, the little dot that's sometimes inside that would tell us to make that hard plosive ba. And instead we're going to make a soft va. So it's actually the word Avram. And this is a compound word. It's a word that's composed of 2 or more words. And in fact, when he changes his name, when the Most High changes his name, he gives him yet a 3rd part of that equation. We'll talk about that probably next week. This week, I want to focus in on his name, the name he was given at birth, Avram. So I've chosen a verse that relates to the overall meaning of his name from this week's portion, from the portion we're studying this week in Genesis 13, and it's verse 17. And the verse says, "Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you." And it's interesting, I chose this verse because it doesn't have the word of the week in it, but it has the essence of the word of the week in it. It has this promise that Yah has made Avram. And this word, arise, is actually the Hebrew word kum. The interesting thing is, this word kum, linguistically, scholars will tell you there's no relationship between this and the other part of Avram's name, lum, but 2 of the letters are identical. And in fact, I would argue that there is a relationship, even though it may not be apparent, because kuf and resh both deal with head, the idea and the concept of the head of something. And so the word lum, which is part of Avram's name, his name is composed of 2 words, as we discussed, Av, which is father, and lum, the root lum, but it's in this compound word, it loses that u, and it just becomes Avram, Avram. So the Av is father, and the lum means exalted, means something that's high, something that's lifted up. So kum also means to arise. It gives it an active component of rising up. So if we look at the individual letters of the name Avram, the first letter is obviously Aleph, and we've seen this letter a lot. I hope all of you know the meanings well. We've seen this letter again and again and again. It's the first letter of the Aleph Bet. It loosely relates to our English A, but in fact, it's one of these silent vowel holding letters, so it can hold various different vowel sounds. But very commonly, it does in fact hold the ah sound. And it's important to realize that there's no short A sound at all in Hebrew. There's no ah, there's only ah. So this Aleph has this connotation of mightiness, of firstness, of strength, of leadership. And in fact, all of those are qualities of our Elohim. And so it's the first letter in the title Elohim. So there in the word, in the title Elohim, obviously it gets the eh sound. So you can see how it can carry a variety of vowels. Here in Avram, because of the nikudot that are below it, it gets the ah sound. So that's the first letter. The second letter is Beit. And Beit, of course, is house. It's a prefix that we use to mean within or in. Sometimes we can translate it as by. But again, it's this idea of dwelling, of family, of this inner, the concept of something within. And so we're going to see how that lends to the name Avram. Then we have the Resh. And the Resh, again, I discussed the Resh and the Kuf, how they both have this idea of head, the head of something, the start of something, the first, the top. And by that token, it also kind of headship, lordship, a prince, right? The Resh, the Rosh, actually the word in Hebrew for head is Rosh. Okay, so it has all of those connotations. And then the final letter is Mem. And the Mem, as it ends the name Avram, lends this meaning of water, of blood, of chaos, of mightiness. Again, we see the mightiness at the beginning and the end, all throughout the name, really. And massiveness, masses, and even masses of people. So it's interesting to note when we have the word Rom, remember that's the root that becomes Ram in Avram, we have one additional letter that was taken away when we compounded it and made it the word Avram. But that Vav comes back in later. That Vav is all about joining something, connecting something, securing something. It's a connection point. It can be a conjunction that means and it's found at the beginning of many, many, many words. So this idea of security, of joining, of being connected and being joined together with something larger than yourself is there inherent. Even though it's hidden in his name, it's still that concept is there, and we'll see how the meanings bear that out. And it's going to relate back to the other name we're going to discuss next. So when we look at this name and we think about how do all of these meanings tie together and inform us about the name Avram, we can see many, many, many relationships. I'm sure you can see many more than I've written down here. We don't have room on the slide for everything, but he exalted the Father, Avram did. And because he exalted the Father, he was exalted by the Father. So this idea of being an exalted Father, we can read it two ways: exalted by the Father, or the one who exalted the Father. And the two go hand in hand, don't they? So he was a mighty leader. He was the chief of the house of Israel, right? Israel would be his grandson. He wasn't born yet, but he would be coming forth from the loins of Avram. He was the promise. The promise was inherent in Avram. He was the beginning of this family of Israel, the beginning of the people. And indeed, the land covenant began with Avram. So he was the beginning of the family and the people of Elohim, the people that Elohim chose for himself. And in fact, he tells them over and over and over in the scriptures, it's not for you, but it's because I promised Avram. It's because of Avram's goodness and faithfulness that you will inherit these blessings. So again, this inner strength that Avram possessed within himself was really Elohim indwelling in him. Because he allowed Elohim to dwell in him, he possessed this inner strength that people around him saw and were like, wow, this man has something. This man has something. And what they were seeing was the power, the mightiness, the strength, the leadership, the firstness, the exalted nature of Elohim expressing through Avram, because he was allowing himself to be a dwelling place, a house for the Father. So if we go back to the Beit, the house, and the Aleph being a symbol of Elohim, he was a house for the Father. And by being a house, by submitting to the Father and saying, I am merely a vessel, the Father took him and used him and made a mighty nation out of him that we are still seeing the fruits of into this day. So but the last connection point that I want to make with Avram is this idea of the blood in the letter Mem. So the blood of Avram, his actual blood, this is a crazy concept. His actual blood was the same bloodline that flowed through our Messiah's veins. So it was through the blood of Avram that this Messiah, this redemption would come, right? And through the blood of Messiah, the entire people would be washed, would be purified, would be made clean, would be made acceptable, like water washes something. So this idea of water and blood is also inherent in his name. So let's look together now at the name Lot, just for a comparison. If we look at the name Lot, first of all, a lot of people pronounce this name Lot, and it's not, because again, in the Hebrew, we would have with the Vav Cholem, which is what we see in his name, we would have the sound O, the long O, the equivalent of an English long O. So Lot was, of course, the nephew of Avram, and really, Lot is not really given any merit of his own up to this point. He's really just connected to, and that's where I said this Vav would come back in, Avram. But if we look at the individual letters, the name itself, first of all, means veiled. Okay, and that's interesting. That's fascinating. This idea of something being covered, being hidden, something being veiled. And the letters themselves, the Lamed, it's like the shepherd's staff, and we've talked about this before, how it has this connotation of teaching, of leading, and it also has this idea of restraining, of being a yoke, something that binds, and thus guides us and moves us to and toward what we should be going toward, and maybe away from what we should not be going toward. The Vav itself is also, again, as we discussed, this idea, and it's interesting that it's here in Lot's name and it was removed from Avram's name. Keep that in mind, and I want to hear some feedback on that. But the idea of joining, of connecting, of being a nail that pierces, of securing, and think about Yeshua and how that covenant was connected, was secured with the Vav, with the nail on the cross. So that letter lends an interesting connection point for this name. And then Tet, the last letter there, it kind of looks like a little snake curling around something. And in fact, the meanings of the Paleo Hebrew, in the Paleo Hebrew, we see this circle with kind of these dividing lines inside. And that's representative of a city, of a town, of a walled village, of something being surrounded. So the idea of mud, of the unknown, of being stuck, of being surrounded by walls, because being surrounded can be good or it can be bad. Right? It can make us feel safe and secure and connected, or it can make us feel vulnerable and stuck and trapped. And so security can work both ways, can't it? A wall can keep us in, or it can keep something dangerous out. And it's all about the context, as we'll see. So when we look at the overall meaning with his name, I want to draw your attention to this verse that I chose. And it's the verse in Isaiah 25:7 that says, "And he will swallow up on this mountain the covering," and that's actually the word chalot, the covering, the veil, the thing that's covering, "that is cast over all the peoples, the veil that is spread over the nations." So keep that in mind as we're looking at these connotations and these meanings. So again, this idea of moving towards something and of security is really very characteristic of Lot. What we saw him do again and again, both when, remember, Avram's going to have to rescue him from the 5 kings and the whole war that happens there, that he gets taken away as a captive, and then the Most High is going to rescue him later, right? So Lot has this tendency to move towards security, toward the security of Sodom in this case, which we'll see coming up here next. And he actually joined himself to this town. Here in this portion, we're seeing him actually moving away from, and that was the Most High separating Lot and Avram for his purposes. He had a destiny for Avram, and he needed to move Lot out of the way, and possibly also to make Lot an example to us. There's many lessons we can learn from Lot. And I think he gets kind of this bad rap, but he certainly was not a righteous, upstanding man in some ways. But it's interesting. We're going to see some parallels between the call of Avram and the call of Lot. So he had this tendency to move towards security, towards safety, but he became stuck in that safety. What felt safe to him there in Sodom created a trap. Right? He was taken away into captivity because of his choice to move towards Sodom. And later we'll see he had to be pulled out of Sodom to be saved. So he became stuck, and he was led toward the yoke of civilization. Civilization has a lot of great things to offer. And when I say civilization, I mean city life. We can kind of think city mouse, country mouse here. And Lot was looking for those good parts of the city life. Or possibly it was his wife. She is the one who looked back. But in any case, we see him even when he's brought out of Sodom later. Remember, he's like, can I just go to this little town over here? I don't really just want to live in the wilderness, right? So he's always being pulled toward this security. And yet, when he was stuck in it, when it had trapped him, he was actually he was bound and connected to Avram, bringing back that Vav. And because of that, he was led away, up and out of that very security that had become a trap for him. So he was led away from Sodom and toward the unknown. And that's one of the other meanings of Tet, is the unknown. Right? So it's interesting that, and we see this a lot in Hebrew, that a word or a letter can have kind of meanings that seem almost opposite from one another at times. So while it can mean security, and we tend to associate security with what we know, it can also be this idea of the unknown, going into captivity in an unknown land, as the hostages in Gaza are. So I chose this So I chose this verse. As the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city." So they're warning him, listen, everything's about to be destroyed. Get up and go out with your wife and all you have. Does that echo a little bit the call that Avram was given? Now, unlike Avram, Lot had to be pulled. He had to be led out, right? So he was moving toward this security, toward this safety. And so to be pulled out of it seemed really scary, right? It seemed scary. And so here we see them urging him to leave. Here we see them urging him to leave because of the danger that's approaching. But he lingered. Unlike Avram, he lingered. So the men, the angels indeed, seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand. And that's an interesting picture. So we have these 2 angels and we've got 4 individuals, Lot, his wife, and his 2 daughters. Well, 2 individuals have 4 hands. So they had their hands full of these people that did not want to be let out. And so he seized them all. They seized them all by the hand. And it says this is because of Yah's mercy. It was because of Yah's mercy and his compassion really for Avram, because he knew this would hurt Avram to have Lot destroyed. So at this point, he pulls them out. The messengers of Yah pull them out, and they brought him out and set him outside the city, outside that tent, outside those walls, outside that security, outside. So they pulled him out, outside of that tent, outside of those walls, that security, that safety, and into this unknown. And again, we see how he really just gravitates right back toward those walls, that safety. It's part of his name. It's part of his character. It's almost an inescapable part of his character. And we'll talk next week more about how the changing of one's name is a powerful indicator of the changing of the